The restaurant exuded an air of elegance, with warm golden lights casting a soft glow over pristine white tablecloths. The clinking of fine china and the murmur of polite conversation created an atmosphere of quiet sophistication. As a tall, well-dressed white man stepped inside with his business partner, his confident stride and the subtle smirk on his lips hinted at a man accustomed to control and success. His sharp eyes scanned the room, searching for the perfect table, but then, he froze. Seated near the corner, poised yet unassuming, was an elderly black woman. Something about her presence stirred an old, half-forgotten memory. It took only a moment before recognition dawned upon him. His lips curled slightly in amusement. His old teacher. The woman who had once stood before his younger self with unwavering authority, chastising him in front of his classmates, making him feel small, holding him accountable in ways no one else dared to. He had resented her back then, her sharp tongue, her high expectations, her refusal to let him coast by on arrogance alone. And now, here she was, just another patron in a restaurant where he held all the power. A slow, deliberate smirk spread across his face as an idea took root in his mind. He turned to his partner, lowering his voice just enough to sound casual but loud enough for effect. "You see that woman over there?" he murmured. "She used to be my teacher. Tough as nails, never let anything slide." He let out a chuckle, shaking his head. Then, as if struck by sudden inspiration, he waved over a waiter. "I think we should liven up the evening. Let's see if she still has that fire in her." His voice was laced with amusement, but beneath it lay something sharper, a quiet, lingering bitterness wrapped in condescension. He leaned back in his chair, waiting for the moment she would be asked to play the violin, fully expecting her to stumble, to fumble with the instrument, to be reduced to a shadow of the formidable woman she once was. He thought he was in control of this moment. What he didn't realize was that he had just set the stage for his own downfall. The woman, her hands slightly trembling from age but still steady with purpose, raised her eyes as the waiter approached. There was a calm, almost serene expression on her face, yet her eyes, deep and observant, seemed to hold decades of wisdom and quiet sorrow. The years had etched themselves into her face, but they hadn't robbed her of her dignity. She knew exactly who he was the moment she saw him. He was the same man who had sat in her classroom many years ago, a boy with a proud smirk on his face, thinking his wealth and status gave him a right to mock her and belittle the work she did. She remembered how he used to challenge her, dismissing her every word with a sneer. She'd been forced to correct him, time and time again, to remind him that knowledge and respect were more important than money or family name. Now, she was older, and those years of struggle, of teaching and living humbly, had transformed her. No longer the young teacher who sought approval or recognition, she had learned that there was strength in silence, power in humility. When he spoke, asking her to play the violin for his own amusement, there was no anger in her heart, only a quiet resolve. She had no intention of showing him how much his words once stung, nor did she care for his mockery. It wasn't his approval she sought, it was something far greater, a truth she had discovered long ago: the dignity of the human spirit cannot be shattered by those who fail to understand it. Without hesitation, she rose from her seat, her body slow but deliberate, each movement a testament to a life lived fully, with grace and quiet strength. She placed her hand on the violin case the waiter had brought, fingers brushing the worn leather with tenderness. The violin was old, its wood seasoned by time, but it was an extension of herself, one of the few things that had never betrayed her. She felt the coolness of the bow, the weight of the strings, and in an instant, the memories of her youth, of the music she had once played with so much passion, flooded her mind. But the years had not dulled her touch. If anything, they had enriched her playing, giving it a depth of emotion that only experience could provide. She lifted the violin to her chin and began to play. The first few notes were soft, tentative, almost like a breath of air brushing against the stillness of the room. But as her bow moved more fluidly across the strings, the music grew bolder, stronger, until the sound filled the space like a rising tide, sweeping away everything in its path. The notes were rich and soulful, each one resonating with a power that seemed to shake the very air around her. She wasn't playing for the man who had once mocked her, nor was she playing to prove anything. She was simply playing because it was who she was, a woman who had lived, who had suffered, and who had triumphed. The man's face, once full of arrogance and superiority, began to change. His smirk faded, his eyes widening in disbelief. He had expected to find amusement in her embarrassment, to see her falter and stumble. But instead, he found himself captivated by the sound, unable to look away, unable to believe what he was hearing. The violin's song was so pure, so deeply moving, that it struck something inside him, something he hadn't even realized was there. The room was silent now, every person in the restaurant drawn into the music, as though it had wrapped itself around them, holding them in a spell. The partner sitting across from the man, once indifferent to the situation, was now visibly moved. His eyes were fixed on the woman as well, his mouth slightly open in astonishment. He didn't know what to say. The power of the music, of the woman's presence, had left him speechless. The man, however, was slowly realizing the gravity of the situation. His initial attempt to belittle her had backfired. He had underestimated her, and now he was witnessing something he had no right to dismiss. As the last note lingered in the air, the woman slowly lowered her violin, her face composed but with a quiet satisfaction, as if the music had said everything she needed to say. She stood there for a moment, allowing the room to settle, the echoes of the violin still hanging in the air. Then, with a graceful nod, she returned to her seat, as if nothing had happened. The man, still processing the scene, opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, his business partner interrupted. With a firm and steady voice, the partner informed him that the contract they had been discussing was no longer on the table. His attitude, his disrespect for the woman, had crossed a line. The partner's disappointment was clear, and the man's attempt at saving face failed miserably. The woman had not only played the violin but had also played him, exposing his arrogance, his ignorance, and his complete lack of understanding of what true dignity meant. In that moment, the lesson was clear: the most powerful people in a room are often the ones who say the least, the ones who don't need to boast or belittle others to feel validated. They let their actions, their dignity, and their talents speak for themselves. And in that moment, the woman had done just that. She had shown him the true meaning of respect, grace, and the unspoken strength that comes from knowing one's own worth. The restaurant was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that feels as though the world is holding its breath. The man sat at the table, his usual self-assurance completely shattered, staring blankly at the remnants of his dinner. His earlier smugness had melted into a cold, uncomfortable dread that tightened around his chest. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the woman, who now sat across from him, playing her violin as though she were effortlessly conjuring a magic only she could create. Every note felt like a silent slap, each vibration striking deeper into his conscience than he ever imagined possible. He had come to the restaurant with one goal in mind: to mock her, to make her feel small in front of everyone. His arrogance was something he had carried for years, and it had served him well, propelling him through life, ensuring he always had the upper hand. But now, as he watched her play, the violin singing a melody that pierced through his arrogance, he felt something he hadn't in years: humiliation. He had expected her to falter, to stumble, to be the object of his derision. Instead, she played with the kind of grace and skill that rendered him completely powerless. The crowd around them had shifted from disinterested diners to attentive listeners, their focus entirely on her, as if the world had stopped for a moment to appreciate what he had underestimated. He could feel the temperature in the room change, the eyes of those around him now shifting from pity to a quiet judgment. It was as though they were all in on a secret he had been too blind to see. The woman was no ordinary person. She was someone whose talent and dignity had stood the test of time, someone whose worth could not be reduced to a cruel joke or the arrogance of a man who thought he could dictate the world around him. But it wasn't just her music that stung. It was the realization that his entire plan had backfired. His eyes darted to his business partner, hoping for some sort of reassurance, some sign that the situation wasn't as dire as it seemed. But the expression on his partner's face told him everything he needed to know: there was no sympathy here. No one was going to forgive him for his behavior. The man's mind raced as the reality set in. The laughter he had imagined hearing at her expense was now replaced by an overwhelming sense of shame. He had underestimated her in every possible way. And in doing so, he had made a fool of himself. The woman's music swirled around him, pulling him deeper into the realization of his own inadequacies. He tried to summon his usual defenses, his charm, his wealth, his influence, but they all felt hollow in the face of the quiet power she exuded. She wasn't playing to win anyone over. She wasn't playing to make a point. She was simply being herself, and in that simple act of authenticity, she had stripped away all of his pretense, leaving him vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. Then, the man heard his partner's voice, calm and unyielding. "I can't continue with this deal," the partner said, his words cutting through the tension in the air like a knife. "What you did here today, the way you treated her. I can't be part of it. I can't associate myself with someone who disrespects others like that. Not in business, not in life. This deal is over." The words hit him harder than he had anticipated, each syllable reverberating in his mind like the mournful echo of the violin. He opened his mouth to protest, to try to salvage what little dignity he had left, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, as if the very air in the room had thickened, making it impossible to speak. The realization settled in like a weight on his chest. He had not only lost the respect of his partner, but he had also lost something far more important, his own sense of self-control. For the first time, he saw himself as others must have seen him all along, a man blinded by his own arrogance, unable to see the value in others, especially when they came from a different background, a different experience. The woman, for her part, had not changed. She continued to play, her violin singing a soft lullaby of defiance, not seeking revenge or recognition, but simply existing in her own truth. She knew that her worth wasn't tied to the approval of someone like him. And as the final notes of the violin echoed in the restaurant, he couldn't help but feel the sting of his own failure, of the arrogance that had led him to this moment. The realization was suffocating. His partner's refusal to move forward with the deal was painful, but it was the least of his worries now. What truly hurt was the fact that he had been exposed for who he truly was, someone who had thought himself superior, only to be shown how deeply flawed he was. He sat there for a moment longer, the weight of the woman's music and his own shortcomings pressing down on him, before slowly standing up and walking out of the restaurant. As he left, the echo of the violin stayed with him, haunting him, a reminder that some things, like respect, integrity, and true strength, could not be bought, and could not be manipulated, no matter how much power he thought he had. The man stepped out of the restaurant, his gait heavy and uncertain, as if each step was a painful reminder of his humiliation. The cool evening air wrapped around him, offering no comfort, as the weight of his actions settled over him like a thick fog. His thoughts were racing, tangled in a web of frustration, disbelief, and an unsettling realization that gnawed at him with each passing second. How had he been so blind? So consumed with arrogance and superiority that he had failed to see the woman for who she truly was? Instead of respecting her, he had sought to mock and belittle her, to reinforce his own inflated sense of power. And now, standing on the sidewalk, he realized how deeply wrong he had been. As he turned to look back at the restaurant, the image of the woman playing her violin lingered in his mind like a haunting melody. Her hands, graceful and poised, had moved effortlessly over the strings, producing notes that seemed to resonate with an otherworldly power. At first, he had been determined to mock her, to show his partner that he could reduce her to nothing more than a joke, a tool to amuse himself. But as the music filled the room, something inside him had shifted. The performance wasn't just beautiful, it was profound. And he had been too blind to recognize it at first. She hadn't just played the violin, she had poured her soul into every note, expressing emotions and experiences that transcended words. The man's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the harsh buzz of his phone. He pulled it out of his pocket, the screen lighting up with a message from his business partner. The words were short, direct, and the final blow to his already shattered ego. "I've contacted the others. The deal is off. We're done." His stomach tightened, his pulse quickening. The words felt like a punch to the gut, a cruel reminder of the consequences of his actions. The deal that he had worked so hard for, the one he had relied on to maintain his status and power, was now gone, lost because of his own short-sightedness and his inability to see the value in people beyond their outward appearance. The man stood there, his phone still in his hand, staring blankly at the screen as if the words hadn't fully registered. But they had. Deep down, he knew that his behavior had led to this moment. He had underestimated the woman in the restaurant, believing that his money and connections would shield him from any real consequences. But in truth, his arrogance had done more damage than he could have ever anticipated. He hadn't just lost a business deal, he had lost the respect of those around him, including his partner, who had seen through his facade and rejected him. A wave of shame washed over him, and he could feel his chest tightening as the gravity of his actions sank in. For the first time in his life, he was confronted with the painful reality that power, wealth, and status were nothing without integrity, without respect for others. He had used his position to demean and belittle, to assert dominance over someone he deemed beneath him. But now, it was clear that he had been the one who was small. The woman, in her quiet dignity, had shown him a strength he could never have imagined. As he looked around, the world seemed to close in on him, the bustling city street no longer offering any sense of comfort or familiarity. He had been so focused on climbing higher, on asserting his superiority, that he had failed to realize that the people he sought to belittle were often the ones with the most to offer. And now, with everything slipping through his fingers, he understood that his own sense of worth had been built on a fragile foundation, one that could easily crumble under the weight of his own ignorance. His phone buzzed again, but this time, he ignored it. There was no need to check. He knew what it would say. He had already lost everything. The music from the restaurant echoed in his mind, the haunting beauty of the violin still lingering in his thoughts. He had tried to mock her, to diminish her talent, but in doing so, he had revealed the ugliness of his own character. She had played not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or disrespected. And in that moment, he realized that he had been one of those people, someone who had failed to see the worth in others. The man took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he stuffed his phone back into his pocket. He stood there for a moment longer, his mind heavy with the weight of his mistakes. There was no going back, no way to undo the damage he had caused. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward. A way to rebuild, not his wealth or his status, but his character. A way to learn, to grow, to become a person who saw others for who they truly were, not through the lens of his own prejudice and superiority. With a final, resolute breath, he turned away from the restaurant and began walking down the street. The city around him seemed distant now, a blur of lights and noise. The only thing that mattered was the lesson he had learned, the hard, painful lesson that true power came not from controlling others, but from treating them with dignity, kindness, and respect. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never be the same again. As the man walked down the quiet, empty street, each step felt like a heavy burden pressing down on him. The night was colder now, the streetlights casting long shadows, yet the chill he felt wasn't from the air, it was from within. The sting of defeat, the deepening weight of regret, seemed to grow with every footstep. He had lost far more than just a business deal. He had lost his sense of control, his belief that he could manipulate and bend the world around him. And in that moment, as the silence enveloped him, the full magnitude of his actions began to sink in. He kept replaying the scene at the restaurant in his mind, the image of the woman sitting there, so composed and dignified. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that his wealth and status could shield him from any consequences. To him, she had been nothing more than a relic of the past, someone he could use for his own amusement, a means of getting a laugh at her expense. Her appearance, with the long, flowing white hair and the quiet grace she carried, had made him think she was someone easily overlooked. He hadn't expected her to have the strength, the wisdom, or the skill to challenge him. Her music had struck him harder than he'd ever anticipated. The violin, which he had initially thought of as a mere tool for mockery, became her voice, her protest, her rebellion. He had expected something clumsy, something laughable, perhaps even embarrassing, but instead, she had played with a passion and precision that left him speechless. Each note she played resonated with him, cutting through his carefully constructed facade, exposing his arrogance and disrespect. And, as much as he hated to admit it, he felt something stir within him that he hadn't felt in a long time: humility. The sound of the violin seemed to echo in his ears, haunting him, as he trudged forward, the heaviness in his chest growing with every step. He thought of his partner, the one who had supported him all these years, now turning his back on him because of his behavior. The words from the text still echoed in his mind: the contract is off. We're done. He had thought his partner was loyal, someone who shared his vision, but now he understood the truth. His partner wasn't just walking away from a business deal, he was walking away from him, from the person he had become. The man had thought he could keep pushing people around, using his influence to get what he wanted, never once considering the consequences. Now, the reality of it all hit him. The power he had clung to was nothing more than an illusion. His wealth, his status, his ability to belittle others, it all seemed so hollow now. He felt small, like a child caught doing something wrong, not knowing how to make it right. The illusion of superiority that had once protected him was gone, stripped away by the piercing sound of the violin and the quiet dignity of a woman he had so carelessly underestimated. He found himself standing at a street corner, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his coat pocket, his thoughts spinning out of control. His life had been built on his own arrogance, on the belief that success was measured by the things he could buy, the people he could control. But now, he saw that those things meant nothing. The true power, the true strength, lay in how one treated others, in the respect one gave, in the empathy one could offer. And he had failed to do any of that. His mind returned to the moment when he first mocked the woman, when he had tried to diminish her with his dismissive comments. At the time, he had felt justified. He had told himself that his wealth made him better, that he was entitled to laugh at someone who wasn't as successful as he was. But now, as he recalled the look on her face, calm and steady, as she played the violin with grace, he realized how wrong he had been. She wasn't just a woman in her twilight years. She was someone who had lived through adversity, who had overcome obstacles far greater than anything he had ever faced, and yet she still carried herself with dignity and poise. And through that, she had shown him a side of life he had never bothered to understand before. As he walked through the empty streets, the realization began to settle in. He had lost far more than just a business deal. He had lost the respect of his partner, the trust of those who had once believed in him. And perhaps, most painfully of all, he had lost a part of himself, a part of his humanity. But in the silence of the night, something within him began to shift. He didn't know how to make amends for what he had done, but he knew he couldn't go back to being the man he had been. The thought of continuing on the same path, the path of arrogance and disregard for others, was no longer an option. He had to change. He had to learn from this moment, to find a way to rebuild not just his reputation but his character. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult. But as he stood still in the middle of the quiet street, staring up at the distant skyline, a new resolve began to take shape. He wasn't sure where it would lead him, but he knew he would no longer allow himself to live a life defined by superiority and mockery. The woman and her violin had taught him something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. In the end, it wasn't wealth or power that mattered. It was the way you treated others, the way you saw them, not as tools to be used, but as equals deserving of respect and dignity. The man didn't know if he could ever undo the damage he had caused, but he vowed to make a different choice moving forward. And for the first time, he felt a sense of hope, something he hadn't felt in years. The woman, with her violin, had opened his eyes to a new possibility. Perhaps, in time, he could rebuild, not just his reputation, but his soul.